Some winters in North Dakota can start early and bring lots of snow with brutal temperatures, and other winters can be mild with less snow. This winter hasn't been too bad.
It's been a favorable winter for our wildlife. We've had some cold temperatures for sure, but the snow depth has been pretty minimal statewide. And then we've had some mild temperatures at times to thaw, and now as we look at the forecast and our current conditions, it looks like maybe the worst is behind us.
With the lack of snow in most places in North Dakota, deer, pheasants, and other wildlife were able to easily access food sources.
We haven't had as much snow this winter, and so the cattail sloughs have stayed mostly open, and that's a key winter habitat for wildlife. Get away from the strong winds and in cold temperatures. Shelter belts, tree rows are very good habitat as well to get through the winters, especially when we're talking about pheasants and deer.
Even though most of winter is behind us, spring storms can also be difficult for wildlife.
We always have to be aware spring weather conditions can be really detrimental to wildlife. If we had bad freezing rain, big blizzards, those can be very detrimental.
The Game and Fish Department has plenty of options to help landowners with habitat improvements for wildlife on their land.
If you're interested in planting grass or shelter belts or doing any type of habitat work, or you don't even know what would be best for your property, give us a call, 701-328-6300, and we'll get you in touch with our private lands biologist. There's programs that we have available, as well as a lot of our partner agencies, that we can find something or a program that would fit your needs.
Quality habitat is essential for wildlife on the northern plains, no matter the time of year.
It's the key for making it through winters. It's the key for production in the spring. That's the key, is to increase our habitat if we do want to have more critters.
This is Mike Anderson in the North Dakota Outdoors.